Hello and welcome to our video on serial killers from the state of Texas. Texas has unfortunately been home to some of the most notorious serial killers in history, with a number of high-profile cases that have shocked the nation. From Henry Lee Lucas to Dean Corll, these killers have left a trail of devastation and tragedy in their wake, claiming countless innocent lives and leaving a lasting impact on the communities they terrorized. The killing sprees of these serial killers were some of the most heinous and disturbing in American history. They targeted victims of all ages and backgrounds, often choosing their victims at random and leaving a wake of fear and paranoia in the society. From the desolate highways of Texas to the suburbs of major cities, no one was safe from the twisted and sadistic impulses of these killers. In this video, we'll take a closer look at some of the most notorious serial killers from Texas and explore the impact of their killing sprees on the state and the nation as a whole. We'll delve into the chilling details of their crimes, examining the psychology and motivations behind their heinous acts. So, buckle up and prepare for a disturbing journey into the dark world of serial killers from Texas. 10. Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lee Lucas is considered one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of the United States. Born in Virginia in 1936, Lucas had a traumatic childhood marked by abuse and neglect. He was frequently beaten and forced to wear dresses by his mother, who was known to be mentally unstable. Lucas's early life was filled with crime and violence. He dropped out of school at a young age and began a life of petty crime, eventually graduating to more serious offenses. He served time in prison for burglary and assault and was known to be a prolific liar and con artist. In the 1960s and 72s, Lucas began a killing spree that lasted for over a decade. He traveled extensively, often hitchhiking or driving stolen vehicles, and targeted victims of all ages and backgrounds. Lucas was known to have killed at least 11 people, but he claimed to have committed hundreds of murders. He often changed his story about the details of his crimes, making it difficult for investigators to confirm the number of people he had actually killed. Lucas was finally caught in 1983 when he was arrested for illegal firearms possession. While in custody, he confessed to hundreds of murders across the country, which led to a massive investigation. However, many of his confessions were found to be false, and there was widespread speculation that Lucas was simply seeking attention or trying to manipulate the justice system. Despite the controversy surrounding Lucas's confessions, he was ultimately convicted of 11 murders. He was sentenced to death for his crimes, but his sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1998 by then-Governor of Texas, George W. Bush. Lucas's murder spree had a profound impact on Texas and the nation as a whole. His crimes sparked widespread fear and paranoia, particularly in small towns and rural areas where people felt vulnerable to his attacks. There was also significant controversy surrounding the investigation and prosecution of his crimes, with many people questioning the validity of his confessions and the accuracy of the evidence used to convict him. In the years following Lucas's conviction, there have been numerous books, documentaries, and other media produced about his crimes. Despite the passage of time, the story of Henry Lee Lucas remains a dark and disturbing chapter in the history of Texas and the United States. 9. Audis Toole. Audis Toole was a notorious serial killer and arsonist who operated in the United States during the 1970s and 82s. Born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida, Toole had a troubled childhood marked by abuse and neglect. He was known to have a low IQ and struggled with reading and writing. Toole began his criminal career at a young age and was arrested multiple times throughout his life for various offenses, including arson and petty theft. He was also known to be a habitual liar and manipulator, frequently changing his stories about his crimes. In the 1970s, Toole began a murder spree that lasted for over a decade. He traveled extensively throughout the southern United States, often hitchhiking or driving stolen vehicles, and targeted victims of all ages and backgrounds. Toole's victims included men, women, and children, and he was known for his brutality and sadism. Toole's most notorious crime was the murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh in 1981. Walsh's abduction and murder was one of the most high-profile cases in American history and helped to bring attention to the issue of child abduction and murder. Toole was finally caught in 1983 when he was arrested for arson. While in custody, he confessed to hundreds of murders, including the murder of Adam Walsh. However, many of his confessions were found to be false, and it is unclear how many people he actually killed. Despite his extensive history of violence and crime, Toole was not convicted of any of the murders he confessed to. He was sentenced to life in prison for arson in 1984 and died in prison on September 15, 1996. Toole's murder spree had a significant impact on Texas and the nation as a whole. His crimes contributed to a sense of fear and paranoia, particularly among parents and families who were concerned about the safety of their children. The high-profile nature of the Adam Walsh case also helped to bring attention to the issue of child abduction and murder and sparked significant changes in the way law enforcement agencies approach these types of crimes. In the years since Toole's death, there have been numerous books, documentaries, and other media produced about his crimes. Despite the passage of time, the story of Audis Toole remains a dark and disturbing chapter in the history of Texas and the United States. 8. Angel Maturino Resendiz. Angel Maturino Resendiz, also known as the Railway Killer, was a notorious serial killer who terrorized Texas and several other states in the United States during the 1990s. Born on August 1, 1959, in Puebla, Mexico, Resendiz had a difficult childhood and was known to be a troubled youth. He had a history of drug and alcohol abuse, as well as mental health issues. Resendiz's killing spree began in the early 1990s and lasted for several years. He targeted victims in Texas, Illinois, Kentucky, and several other states, often choosing victims who lived near railway tracks. He would gain access to their homes by breaking in or posing as a railroad worker and then brutally murder them. Resendiz's killing spree was marked by extreme violence and brutality. He would often use a variety of weapons, including hammers and axes, to bludgeon his victims to death. He was also known to sexually assault some of his victims and would sometimes leave behind occult symbols at the crime scenes. Despite his extensive criminal history and the significant resources devoted to capturing him, Resendiz managed to evade law enforcement for several years. However, in 1999, he was finally apprehended by authorities in Texas after a massive manhunt. Resendiz was ultimately convicted of multiple murders and was sentenced to death in 2000. He was executed by lethal injection on June 27, 2006. The impact of Resendiz's killing spree on Texas and the surrounding states was significant. His crimes sparked widespread fear and paranoia, particularly among those who lived near railway tracks. Law enforcement agencies in Texas and other states were forced to devote significant resources to tracking down Resendiz and investigating his crimes. The story of Angel Maturino Resendiz was widely covered in the media, both nationally and internationally. His crimes and subsequent arrest and execution were seen as a reminder of the dangers posed by violent criminals and the importance of effective law enforcement efforts. In the years since Resendiz's execution, his story has continued to captivate the public's attention. His crimes are often cited as some of the most heinous and disturbing in the history of the United States, and his legacy serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and strong law enforcement efforts in combating violent crime. 7. Kenneth Allen McDuff. Kenneth Allen McDuff, also known as the Broomstick Killer, was a notorious serial killer who operated in Texas during the 1980s. Born on March 21, 1946, in Rosebud, Texas, McDuff had a troubled childhood marked by abuse and neglect. He was known to have a low IQ and struggled with reading and writing. McDuff began his criminal career at a young age and was arrested multiple times throughout his life for various offenses, including theft and assault. However, it wasn't until the early 1980s that he began his killing spree. Between 1984 and 1991, McDuff brutally murdered at least 9 people in Texas, including 3 teenagers. He would often lure his victims into his car, sexually assault them, and then murder them using a variety of methods, including strangulation and stabbing. McDuff's killing spree came to an end in 1992 when he was finally apprehended by law enforcement in Kansas. He was later convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. However, McDuff's case took a shocking turn in 1999 when he was released from prison after the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles granted him parole. The decision to release McDuff sparked widespread outrage and condemnation, particularly among the families of his victims and victims' rights advocates. McDuff's release led to significant changes in the Texas criminal justice system. The state's parole laws were revised to make it more difficult for violent offenders like McDuff to be released from prison. The case also brought attention to the issue of capital punishment and the debate over whether the death penalty was an effective deterrent to violent crime. In 2000, McDuff was finally caught and arrested after he committed a new murder in Texas. He was later convicted and sentenced to death for this crime, as well as for his earlier murders. The impact of McDuff's killing spree on Texas was significant. His crimes sparked widespread fear and paranoia, particularly among young women who lived in the areas where he operated. The case also helped to bring attention to the issue of serial killers and the importance of effective law enforcement efforts in tracking down and apprehending these dangerous criminals. In the years since McDuff's conviction and execution, his story has continued to captivate the public's attention. His crimes are often cited as some of the most heinous in the history of Texas, and his legacy serves as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and strong law enforcement efforts in combating violent crime. 6. Dean Corll. Dean Corll, also known as the Candyman, was a notorious serial killer who operated in Houston, Texas during the early 1970s. Born on December 24, 1939, in Indiana, Corll moved to Texas with his family in the 1950s. He was known to be a troubled youth and dropped out of high school in his senior year. Corll's killing spree began in 1970 and lasted for several years. He would lure young boys into his van by offering them candy or money and then take them to his home or another location where he would torture and sexually assault them before murdering them. Corll's victims ranged in age from 9 to 19 years old, and he is known to have killed at least 28 young boys. Corll's killing spree came to an end in 1973 when he was shot and killed by one of his accomplices, Elmer Wayne Henley, who had become disillusioned with Corll's crimes. Henley then led authorities to the location where Corll had buried many of his victims. The discovery of Corll's crimes shocked the nation and had a significant impact on the state of Texas. The case brought attention to the issue of serial killers and the dangers they pose to young people, particularly in urban areas. The investigation also revealed significant shortcomings in the law enforcement response to missing persons cases, as many of Corll's victims had been reported missing but had not received adequate attention from authorities. The impact of Corll's crimes on the families of his victims was profound. The parents of his victims were left with a sense of profound grief and loss, and many struggled to come to terms with the horrific nature of Corll's crimes. The case also had a lasting impact on the community in Houston, which was left with a sense of shock and disbelief at the magnitude of the crimes that had been committed in their midst. In the years since Corll's crimes were uncovered, his legacy has continued to haunt the state of Texas. His story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and other media, and his crimes are often cited as some of the most heinous in the history of the United States. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of strong law enforcement efforts in tracking down and apprehending violent criminals, as well as the need for improved support for victims of violent crime and their families. 5. Charles Albright. Charles Albright, also known as the Eyeball Killer, was a notorious serial killer who terrorized Texas in the 1990s. Born on August 10, 1933, in Amarillo, Texas, Albright was known as a quiet and intelligent child who excelled academically. However, as he grew older, he began to display increasingly disturbing behavior. Albright's killing spree began in 1990 when he murdered Mary Lou Pratt, a 41-year-old sex worker in Dallas. He then went on to kill at least 2 other women, Shirley Williams and Susan Beth Peterson, both also sex workers. Albright's modus operandi was particularly gruesome. He would remove the eyes of his victims with a surgical instrument, leading to his infamous nickname. The investigation into Albright's crimes was one of the most extensive in the history of Texas law enforcement. Detectives pored over evidence and interviewed hundreds of witnesses in an effort to track down the elusive killer. It wasn't until a search of Albright's home turned up incriminating evidence that he was finally arrested in 1991. Albright was ultimately convicted of the murder of Mary Lou Pratt and sentenced to life in prison. While he was never formally charged with the murders of Shirley Williams and Susan Beth Peterson, it is widely believed that he was responsible for their deaths as well. Albright's crimes had a profound impact on the state of Texas, particularly on the sex worker community. The murders of these women highlighted the dangers faced by those working in the sex industry and underscored the need for better protections and support for these individuals. Albright's story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and true crime shows, and his case remains one of the most shocking in the annals of Texas criminal history. His legacy serves as a chilling reminder of the dark underbelly of society and the dangers that lurk within our communities. 4. Corll Eugene Watts. Corll Eugene Watts was a notorious serial killer who terrorized Texas in the early 1980s. Born on November 7, 1953, in Texas, Watts was known for his troubled childhood and erratic behavior. Watts began his killing spree in 1981, targeting young women who lived alone. He would often enter their homes in the early morning hours and strangle them to death. Despite the high number of victims, Watts managed to evade capture for several years, continuing his killing spree unchecked. It wasn't until Watts was arrested in Michigan in 1982 for attempted murder that he was linked to the murders in Texas. During his trial, he confessed to the murders of 12 women, though some believe he may have been responsible for as many as 80 deaths. Watts' crimes had a profound impact on the state of Texas. The case highlighted the dangers faced by women who lived alone and the need for better protections for vulnerable individuals. It also brought attention to the issue of serial killers and the difficulty that law enforcement agencies face in tracking down and apprehending these dangerous criminals. Watts was eventually convicted of the murder of 13 women and sentenced to life in prison. However, due to a legal loophole in Texas law, he was eligible for parole after just 20 years. In 2006, he died of prostate cancer while still in prison. Despite his death, Watts' legacy lives on, and his story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and true crime shows. His case remains one of the most shocking in the annals of Texas criminal history, serving as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk within our communities. 3. Derrick Todd Lee. Derrick Todd Lee was a serial killer who operated in Louisiana and Texas from 1998 to 2003. Born on November 5, 1968, in Louisiana, Lee was known to have a troubled childhood, including struggles with drugs and alcohol. Lee began his killing spree in 1998, targeting young women in the Baton Rouge area. He would often stalk his victims before attacking them, and his crimes were marked by their extreme violence. Over the next few years, he continued to target and kill women, even as law enforcement agencies struggled to track him down. It wasn't until 2002 that Lee was finally arrested for the murder of Geraldine DeSoto. DNA evidence linked him to the crime, and he was subsequently linked to several other murders in Louisiana and Texas. In total, Lee is believed to have killed at least 7 women, though some estimates place the number much higher. Lee's crimes had a profound impact on the communities in which he operated. The case highlighted the dangers faced by women and underscored the importance of strong law enforcement efforts to identify and apprehend dangerous criminals. Following his arrest and conviction, Lee was sentenced to death. However, his case was marked by controversy, including concerns over the use of DNA evidence and allegations of racial bias in the justice system. Despite these challenges, Lee's legacy lives on, and his story remains a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked violence and the importance of swift and effective law enforcement. While the pain and trauma caused by his crimes will never fully heal, the determination of those impacted by his actions to seek justice and ensure the safety of their communities stands as a testament to the resilience and strength of the human spirit. 2. William Bonin. William Bonin was a notorious serial killer known as the Freeway Killer who operated in California and was suspected of killing at least 21 young men and boys. Bonin was born on January 8, 1947 in Connecticut and grew up in a troubled home, experiencing physical and emotional abuse at the hands of his father. Bonin himself was a victim of sexual abuse by older boys when he was younger. As a young man, Bonin joined the U.S. Air Force and served in the Vietnam War, where he was stationed as a military policeman. Upon returning to the United States, Bonin began working as a truck driver and began his killing spree in 1979. He would often lure young men and boys into his vehicle, torture them, and then kill them, dumping their bodies along the highways in California. Bonin's crimes were marked by their extreme brutality, and he often recruited accomplices to help him carry out his killings. He was eventually apprehended in 1980 after police discovered one of his victims alive in his vehicle, leading to his arrest and conviction. Bonin's crimes had a significant impact on the state of Texas and the broader United States. The case highlighted the dangers faced by young people who hitchhiked and the need for greater public awareness of the risks of such activities. The case also drew attention to the issue of serial killers and the challenges that law enforcement agencies face in tracking down and apprehending these dangerous individuals. Bonin was eventually sentenced to death for his crimes and was executed by lethal injection in 1996. His case remains one of the most shocking and brutal in the annals of U.S. criminal history, serving as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk within our society and the importance of strong law enforcement efforts to keep our communities safe. 1. Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells was a notorious American serial killer who confessed to murdering at least 22 people, although some estimates suggest that his true body count may have been much higher. Born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, Sells had a troubled childhood marked by neglect and abuse. He was also a victim of sexual assault by a family member when he was a child. Sells began his killing spree in 1985, targeting women and children across the United States. He would often break into homes and attack his victims with knives or other sharp objects. He was also known to use a variety of disguises and aliases to evade detection by law enforcement officials. One of Sells' most notorious crimes was the murder of 13-year-old Kayleen Harris in Texas in 1999. Sells broke into the Harris family's home and attacked Kayleen as she slept. He then attempted to murder Kayleen's 10-year-old friend, Crystal Searles, but the girl managed to survive by playing dead. Searles was able to provide a description of her attacker to police, which ultimately led to Sells' arrest. Sells was known for his unusual methods of disposing of his victims' bodies, often burying them in shallow graves or dumping them in remote locations. He also used a variety of techniques to avoid leaving behind physical evidence, including changing his appearance, wearing gloves, and burning or burying his clothing. Sells was eventually caught and convicted of several murders, and in 2014, he was executed by lethal injection in Texas. His crimes had a significant impact on the communities in which he operated, and his case highlighted the importance of public awareness and strong law enforcement efforts to track down and apprehend dangerous criminals. In addition to the devastating impact on his victims and their families, Sells' case also raised important questions about the nature of violence and the complex interplay of environmental and genetic factors that can contribute to criminal behavior. While Sells' crimes will never be fully understood or justified, his story serves as a cautionary tale of the dangers that lurk within our society and the need for continued efforts to prevent and combat violent crime. So that was our deep dive into the chilling world of serial killers in Texas. These heinous crimes have left a lasting impact on the communities in which they occurred, and they serve as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk within our society. As we close this chapter on these terrifying stories, it's important to remember that we all have a role to play in preventing and combating violent crime. By staying aware and vigilant, supporting law enforcement efforts, and advocating for effective policies and interventions, we can help to keep our communities safe and ensure that these tragedies are never repeated. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we hope that you will continue to follow us as we explore more crime stories from around the world. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.